Jason Brooks had always been a man of the law, a dedicated police officer who believed in justice, order, and respect. In his uniform, he was firm but fair. Yet, despite his professional strength, Jason faced battles no badge could protect him from. His home life had been falling apart for months, and deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. His wife, Melissa, had grown distant. Cold stares, late nights, and whispered phone calls had become the norm. Meanwhile, Jason's father, Frank Brooks, a retired cop himself, had taken it upon himself to help Jason through his struggles. Frank had always been a powerful figure, respected in the community, but domineering behind closed doors. He never missed a chance to remind Jason of his failures, making him feel like a shadow of the man Frank once was. One evening, after a grueling double shift, Jason arrived home earlier than expected. The house was dimly lit, and an eerie silence filled the air. Something felt off. He placed his keys quietly on the counter and crept down the hall. As he neared the bedroom, muffled voices reached his ears, a man's low chuckle and Melissa's familiar giggle. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He swung the door open, and there they were. His wife and his own father, tangled together in betrayal. Time seemed to stop. Frank had the nerve to smirk, as if daring Jason to react. "You were never man enough to keep her," Frank sneered, pulling on his shirt. Jason trembled with rage, but years of discipline kept him from losing control. "Get out," Jason growled through clenched teeth. Frank buttoned his shirt slowly, as if savoring Jason's humiliation. Melissa sat silently, avoiding his gaze. As Frank walked past Jason, he leaned in close and whispered, "You'll never be half the man I am." For weeks, Jason barely held himself together. Frank paraded around town like nothing had happened, using his influence to quietly spread rumors that Jason was unstable, a loose cannon cop who couldn't control his temper. The whispers grew louder, and soon Jason's job was at risk. His reputation crumbled before his eyes, all while Frank enjoyed the spectacle. But Frank had underestimated one thing: Jason's patience. Jason knew Frank had skeletons in his closet. Digging through old records, Jason found what he needed: a long-buried case from Frank's time on the force. Frank had been involved in a shady narcotics bust nearly 2 decades ago. Missing drugs. Unexplained cash. The pieces fit, and Jason knew just how to expose it. One evening, Jason waited outside Frank's favorite bar, watching him swagger inside. Minutes later, Jason followed. The place was noisy, filled with laughter and cigarette smoke. Frank sat at the bar, enjoying his drink like a king holding court. "Evening, Dad," Jason said coldly, sliding onto the stool beside him. Frank chuckled dryly. "What are you doing here? Thought you couldn't face me." Jason smirked. "Oh, I've been busy. Found some interesting paperwork from back when you were still wearing a badge. Missing evidence, unfiled reports. Curious stuff." Frank's smile faltered. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jason leaned in closer. "I know you skimmed thousands from that bust. I know exactly where you hid it, and I know the department would love to hear the truth." Frank's face turned red. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," Jason challenged. "But I've got a better offer. Walk away, leave town. No one needs to know." Frank clenched his fist. "And if I don't?" Jason smiled grimly. "Then I make sure everyone knows the kind of man you really are." For the first time in months, Frank was silent. The man who had controlled every moment of Jason's life now looked powerless. Without another word, Frank stormed out of the bar. Days passed, and true to his word, Frank quietly packed his bags and vanished. Jason began rebuilding his life, gaining back the respect he'd lost. Melissa, realizing the weight of her betrayal, tried reaching out. But Jason knew some wounds cut too deep to heal. Just when Jason thought he could finally breathe again, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of Frank, standing beside a man Jason recognized from the old narcotics bust case file. Written on the back were chilling words, "He knows you know." Jason's stomach dropped. Something told him Frank wasn't finished yet. Jason stared at the photograph for what felt like an eternity. The man standing beside Frank in the picture was Tony Grimaldi, a ruthless ex-con tied to organized crime. Grimaldi's reputation was infamous. Intimidation, violence, and disappearances followed him like a shadow. If Frank had ties to Grimaldi, Jason knew trouble was brewing. Jason's instincts screamed danger, but he couldn't ignore it. He went straight to the station, pulling every file he could find on Grimaldi. The reports painted a grim picture: suspected drug trafficking, illegal weapons sales, and even whispers of contract killings. The only reason Grimaldi wasn't behind bars was a lack of hard evidence. He operated in the shadows, and the authorities had never managed to pin him down. 2 nights later, Jason returned home from another late shift. The neighborhood was quiet, but something felt off. As he stepped onto his porch, he noticed his front door was slightly ajar. His heart pounded. He reached for his sidearm and stepped inside cautiously. The living room was dark, but the faint glow of a cigarette flickered from the far corner. "Evening, officer," a gravelly voice murmured. Jason's pulse raced as Tony Grimaldi stepped into the dim light, his face twisted in a cold smile. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't," Grimaldi said, taking a slow drag from his cigarette. "Get out of my house," Jason growled, hand tightening on his weapon. Grimaldi chuckled. "Relax. I'm just here to deliver a message. Frank, he's not happy you dug up the past. He's got friends who'd rather keep certain things quiet." Jason's jaw clenched. "If Frank thinks he can scare me off, he's dead wrong." "I wouldn't be so sure," Grimaldi sneered. "See, Frank knows you've got more to lose than just your badge." With that, Grimaldi flicked his cigarette onto the carpet and walked out the door, leaving Jason frozen in place. He rushed to stomp out the ember before it caught fire, his mind racing. Frank wasn't just trying to protect his secrets, he was willing to destroy Jason's life to do it. The next day, Jason packed a bag for his ex-wife Melissa. Whatever Frank's plan was, Jason knew she was a target. Despite their broken relationship, he couldn't risk her safety. Melissa resisted at first, but Jason's grave expression silenced her protests. "I need you to trust me," Jason insisted. "Stay with your sister. Don't answer the door unless you're sure it's safe." That night, Jason parked his car down the block from Frank's old house, the place Jason knew Frank had been hiding since leaving town. Hours dragged by as Jason watched the house, waiting for movement. Just past midnight, a shadow emerged from the side door, Frank. He moved swiftly, heading toward a black SUV parked on the curb. Jason started his engine, ready to follow. But then he noticed someone else, Tony Grimaldi, standing just beyond the streetlight. Frank didn't see him, but Grimaldi saw Frank. Jason's blood ran cold. Whatever deal Frank thought he'd struck with Grimaldi, things were about to take a deadly turn. Jason sat at his kitchen table, the photo still clutched in his hand. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned it over again, reading those chilling words, "He knows you know." The man in the picture, a face from Frank's dark past, was none other than Victor Salazar, a notorious drug lord who disappeared years ago after a botched narcotics bust. Jason knew Victor was dangerous, the kind of man who didn't let unfinished business slide. Jason's mind raced. Was Frank working with Victor again? Had Victor resurfaced, or was this a warning from someone else? Either way, Jason knew one thing, he wasn't safe. Determined to get answers, Jason spent the next few days tracking Frank's known associates. He visited old bars, questioned retired cops, and followed whispers around town. Most leads went cold, until one night, Jason's instincts drew him to an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts. He parked his car a block away and approached quietly. Peering through a crack in the boarded-up window, Jason's heart pounded. Inside, Frank stood with Victor Salazar himself, their conversation tense and heated. Jason strained to hear. "I did what you asked," Frank barked. "I vanished. You said that was enough." Victor's cold laugh echoed off the walls. "You think I forgot how much you owe me? That little stash of yours, the one you skimmed off my operation? I want it back." "I don't have it," Frank growled. "It's gone." Victor's smile disappeared. "Then you better find it, or your boy's next." Jason froze. His blood turned cold. Victor was threatening him. Before he could react, Victor's eyes flicked toward the window. "We've got company." Jason bolted for his car, but footsteps pounded behind him. He barely reached the driver's side when a pair of rough hands yanked him back. 2 of Victor's men pinned him against the hood. "Looks like the cops been poking around," one sneered. Moments later, Victor emerged from the shadows, grinning like a predator. "Jason Brooks," he said slowly. "You're just like your old man, always in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Let him go," Frank's voice rang out from behind. He stepped forward, shaking but defiant. "I'll get you what you want. Just leave him out of this." "No," Victor smirked. "He's coming with us. You've got 48 hours to find my money, or your boy's finished." Before Jason could shout, a cloth bag was shoved over his head, plunging him into darkness. Jason's pulse hammered in his ears as Victor Salazar's cold stare drilled into him. The warehouse reeked of oil and stale smoke, and Jason's hands throbbed from the tight ropes biting into his wrists. Frank stood in the shadows, his face twisted with smug satisfaction. "I told you not to dig where you don't belong," Frank sneered. "Now you've got Victor's attention." Victor knelt beside Jason, his blade glinting under the dim lights. "You're gonna tell me where my money is," Victor said calmly, pressing the tip of the knife to Jason's throat. "Your old man stole from me, and now you're both gonna pay." Jason gasped. "You think I have it? I don't know where the money is." Victor's eyes narrowed. "See, I don't believe that." He turned to Frank. "You said he'd know something. You lied to me?" Frank's smug expression faltered. "Look, he's bluffing. He knows more than he's saying. Just give me some time with him." Victor scowled, then suddenly lashed out, slicing a shallow cut across Frank's arm. Frank yelped, clutching his bleeding limb. "I don't need you anymore," Victor growled. Jason seized the moment. Using the sharp edge of a rusted metal beam behind him, he frantically sawed at the ropes binding his wrists. The fibers tore just enough for one hand to slip free. He kept still, biding his time. "Tell me where my money is," Victor barked again. All right. Frank stammered, his face pale. "It's at my old storage unit off Belmont Avenue." Victor sneered. "You better pray you're telling the truth." He motioned for his men to grab Frank. As Victor turned his back, Jason sprang into action. He lunged forward, knocking Victor off balance. The knife clattered across the floor. Jason grabbed it and cut the remaining ropes from his wrists. Frank stumbled back, but Victor's men grabbed him before he could escape. Victor, regaining his balance, pulled a gun from his waistband and aimed it squarely at Jason. "You think this ends here?" Victor snarled. "I'm not letting either of you walk away." Before Victor could pull the trigger, red and blue lights flashed through the dusty windows. Police sirens blared outside. "Looks like you've got company," Jason said, barely masking his relief. Victor's face twisted in fury. "This ain't over," he spat before bolting toward a back exit, his men scattering in different directions. Jason staggered out of the warehouse, his heart racing. Officers stormed the building, taking control of the scene. But as Jason turned to look for Frank, he was gone. Later that night, Jason returned home to find an envelope taped to his door. Inside was a photograph, his ex-wife Melissa, tied to a chair, her face bruised and terrified. Scrawled beneath it were chilling words. "You found my money. Now bring it to me, or she dies." Jason's pulse hammered in his ears as he crept toward the decrepit warehouse. The faint glow of flickering lights seeped through the broken windows. Inside, Melissa was somewhere, trapped and terrified. And Frank? Jason knew his father would stop at nothing to prove he was still in control. Jason's hand hovered over his holstered weapon. He knew charging in recklessly could get Melissa killed, but waiting too long might cost her life. Taking a deep breath, he pressed against the wall and peered through a crack in the boarded-up door. Inside, Frank paced back and forth, barking orders at a man Jason recognized from the old narcotics bust file, Marcus Vaughn, a known gang enforcer. Melissa was tied to a chair, her face streaked with tears. Frank's voice cut through the air, low and menacing. "You should have kept your mouth shut," Frank sneered. "But no. You had to push me. Now your husband's got a choice, either he lets this go, or he loses you." Melissa's trembling voice quivered, "He's not afraid of you anymore." Frank chuckled darkly. "That's where you're wrong." Jason felt something shift inside him, a fire he'd suppressed for too long. He wasn't the scared son Frank used to bully. He was a cop, a protector, and this time Frank had pushed too far. Drawing his gun, Jason moved swiftly, slipping through the side door. The rusty hinge creaked, and Marcus spun toward the sound. "Don't move." Jason barked, leveling his weapon. Frank grabbed Melissa, pressing a knife to her throat. "Drop the gun." Frank roared. "You know what happens if you don't." Jason froze, sweat trickling down his neck. "Dad, you don't have to do this. Don't tell me what I have to do." Frank's face contorted with rage. "I spent my whole life cleaning up your messes. You were always weak. Always disappointing. Well, guess what? Now you're going to learn what happens when you cross me." "You're the one who messed up," Jason shot back. "The evidence, the stolen cash, you think Marcus is still loyal to you?" Frank faltered, his grip on Melissa loosening slightly. "What are you talking about?" Jason shifted his gaze to Marcus. "I know Frank cut you out of that payout. I've seen the records." Marcus' eyes narrowed. "That true, Frank? Don't listen to him. Frank snapped. He's just stalling. Am I? Jason challenged. Ask yourself, if Frank's willing to use his own son to cover his tracks, what's he willing to do to you? Marcus hesitated just long enough. In a flash, Jason lunged forward. The moment Frank turned the blade away from Melissa, Jason fired a single shot into Frank's arm. Frank howled in pain, dropping the knife. Marcus bolted out the back door, leaving Frank clutching his bleeding arm. Jason rushed to Melissa, untying her ropes as she sobbed into his chest. It's okay, Jason whispered. You're safe now. Frank groaned on the floor, his face twisted in pain and fury. You think this is over? He spat. You'll never be free of me. Jason stared down at him, cold and unwavering. You already lost, Dad. As sirens wailed in the distance, Jason knelt beside Frank. You spent your whole life trying to control me, Jason said quietly. But in the end, you destroyed yourself. Frank's eyes darkened with hate. You're nothing without me. Jason stood tall, gripping Melissa's hand. I'm more than you ever were. As police officers swarmed the scene, Jason knew justice had been served. But deep inside, a nagging feeling lingered. Frank's final words echoed in his mind, like a warning that the storm wasn't truly over. Then, hours later at the station, a plain envelope was delivered to Jason's desk. Inside was a note written in shaky handwriting. He's still out there. And he's coming for you. Jason's stomach dropped. Frank had allies, and the battle wasn't over yet.